Thank you very much. So yeah, this is RentPath headless testing, or there we go. How to test faster without losing your head. The RentPath story. As I mentioned, I'm John Theodore. This is Abdur Jubair, and we're just going to jump right into it here. But first, we're going to go all the way back to 2015 when we both first started at the company. And anyone in the audience, if we want to do a show of hands, let me know if this sounds familiar. Doing a 2-week sprint cycle and releasing once per sprint. Maybe some people are even releasing slower than that, but that's where we were at. We did have automated tests that would run in a nightly regression on multiple browsers, and because the first place that we were doing any testing in our code was in the staging environment, in our QA staging environment, that meant that all bugs would make it to QA. That's the first time we were looking for them and the first place that we were checking. So that was the first place that we would find any of them. As a result of that being the only place that we're really checking before releasing to production, we unfortunately had some bugs make it into production. Sometimes they were critical bugs. That means hot fixes. And as I'm sure that you guys know, whenever you're dealing with a hot fix late at night, you might feel like this guy right here who has lost his head. So we set about putting out some goals. We wanted to work better. We wanted to work smarter. We wanted to have a healthier development environment. So we wanted to release multiple times per day, if possible. This is the goal that we wanted to get to. We wanted to push more code through our pipeline with greater confidence in the stability of that code, that we were not going to break existing functionality. And we wanted to, in order to do this, we needed to get the results on our tests back a lot quicker. We needed to get meaningful feedback back in a much faster period of time for this to work. So we laid out a roadmap to success, which included 100% automated coverage, more than we had previously. We didn't have everything covered, but we always consider 100% automation coverage to be something that is a goal that you aspire and work towards. But there are always going to be unintended cases, so this is an aspirational goal. We wanted to test continuously against every commit, every push to GitHub, and have a continuous delivery pipeline. And we needed that pipeline to be reliable, something that we could rely on to test thoroughly and allow us to deliver that quality code quickly to production. So, Abdur, what's going on here?
Yes, like JT mentioned, at this point, we had our tests running in our CD pipeline. We had our entire suite running on the CD pipeline. But the problem is that it was taking somewhere between 20 to 30 minutes to actually execute the tests. And that's really long time for us. For other companies, that might be really good. That might be ideal. But it was not acceptable by our management or us as a team. The reason because we were running the tests on every commit. So developer has to wait for 20 to 30 minutes before they can actually merge their PR. So what happens, as we all have, they're flaky tests. So a flaky test will fail, guess what happens? Developer has to run that pipeline build again, and they have to wait for another 30 minutes. That adds up. That takes away time for them doing meaningful work that could add value to the company, right? So that was frustrating to the developers and everyone else because it was just time consuming. So one of the things that I mentioned earlier that all the tests that we have, we're running the entire suite. But we're running them in parallel. With the parallel, it was taking 20 to 30 minutes. And for that, we need VMs. And VMs are very costly, to say the least.
Yeah, you can't.
Before I move on to Headless, I want to cover a few things that we have done to optimize our code. One of the things that we have done is we went through our code. We removed all the redundant code that we had to get a better result and reduce our runtime. Also, we went through the code and removed all the pauses. Any pauses that we had, any explicit wait that we have had, we removed them. That did give us some, that reduced some runtime, but this is not where we want it to be. We want it to be somewhere close to single digit or better than that. So what about headless? After trying all those things, we were thinking about headless, and this is the time where Sauce Lab came up with Sauce Lab Beta. So as soon as that came aboard, that's something that we're thinking about as a team. We jumped on board, and we started implementing. But we had some questions. Just because it's a newer technology, we're getting into it. The couple of things that we had concern about is that, are we going to lose any coverage gap? With the regular VMs, our test suite was running fine. With the going to headless, do we have to compromise on any of the features now that we currently have, the test that we currently have, or going forward, any feature that we're going to be building, are we going to have to compromise because it's headless, because we cannot run it on headless? Stability. Are we going to have more flaky tests in headless? Also, maintenance. As we all know, we can actually see when we're running tests on regular VMs, it's live, you can actually see it. It's better to debug, to pinpoint where the problem is. With headless, you don't see that. So are we going to have to spend a lot more time to debug a failure? So that's the concern that we had getting into headless. However, as a team, we thought it's going to give us more advantage moving to headless and getting that runtime. So we went ahead and implemented headless in our pipeline. Doing so, we came across some hurdles. One of the ones that was some of the web elements were not rendering for headless, like they were rendering in the regular VMs. One which was we use Google Map heavily in our application. So Google Map references were not rendering that we found when we were using the headless containers. Also, we had to work around our tests, some of our tests, to make it more stable. One of the examples that I can give, so what happened with headless, the tests that were stable in the regular VM were flaky in the headless. The reason because headless runs a little bit slow. So for example, if I'm clicking on an element and it goes to the next page, when the page renders, the element that I'm verifying, it takes 2 to 3 milliseconds to appear. With the headless, it's faster, right? So I'm not getting that time, and that's the reason test is failing. So we didn't go and put a pause on the test. What we did, we actually added another check before that, I want to actually check, and check that element that was going to be visible that 2 to 3 seconds earlier, and then go check that. So we had to do some work around it to actually make our tests more stable. Memory capacity on headless containers are lower than compared to the regular VMs. And we came across some issues as well, some flakiness in the test, but nothing that we could not resolve programmatically.
Right.
Now, JT, where are we now?
Well, so we've got headless implemented. We overcame some of those challenges, and we have found that headless has been the key to unlocking that speed that we were looking for. Obviously, we talked about a few hurdles that we ran into. Specifically with the Google Map, that's just something that for a few of our tests, we couldn't necessarily get those working. And then, as Abdur said, with memory, with the less memory available and things like that, we have a pretty memory-intensive application, and some of our longer tests didn't work. So by splitting some of those up, we were able to get that down. But for the other tests, what we did is so instead of having, we have a two-forked pipeline where we run our desktop tests and our mobile tests in parallel and then split those parallel. So what we did is we had 2 additional forks where we run the bulk of the tests in headless And then anything that we currently haven't been able to get stable and running in headless yet, we just run that small batch of tests against normal VMs as well, but we're still able to drastically reduce the number of VMs we require to run the entire thing, the entire framework, and swap those out for headless. So overall, the speed has gone down. We were at 20 to 30 minutes, as Abdur said, for a run of the entire suite, even when everything passed. Now we're running under 7 minutes consistently. So the developers are getting things back a whole lot faster. Also, if we need to scale out and get more headless containers, so that the tests are executing faster on headless. If we just run the same exact test, one-to-one, we get faster execution time on headless than we did in a Chrome VM. But additionally, because the headless containers cost less, we can purchase more concurrency and have greater parallelization at the same cost, where, look, for some big companies, you might be able to go out and say, oh, we need to add 500 more VMs to get the speed that we want. We weren't in that position. We need to think about budget and be budget conscious, and I'm sure that a lot of folks are in that same boat. So for us, particularly for our CD pipeline and getting the speed that we need there, make the headless containers costing less was a big, big part of that. We still do keep some normal VMs around to continue running our nightly regressions so that we're still doing a sanity check on all browsers. But as been talked about in a lot of other talks, generally what you want is you want to fail much earlier in the process so that those later checks that take progressively longer to run are much more stable and really just a sanity check. So now we're not all the way to our goal that we had stated. We're not yet releasing multiple times a day, but we are releasing multiple releases of the same app on a weekly basis. We tend to release 2 to 3 times a week now. Hot fixes have been almost eliminated. If a bug does make it into production, we're no longer seeing those really bad critical bugs that require a hot fix. It's usually something minor that we can just bundle into the next release. And because the releases are coming much more frequently, the pain point of that is a lot lower. If we find a bug, we know that it's gonna, if we find something that was wrong with the Tuesday release, we're already going to release on Thursday, so we can bundle it into that, where it's not gonna be 2 weeks until the next release, and so there's no fire drill anymore on that. But because we're running our tests against every pull request and every push before they even get into the master branch, we're not getting those super critical application breaking bugs even making it into our staging environments. As I said, the results now, we're under 7 minutes on those. And because we have removed this bottleneck, the tests aren't taking so long, they're less brittle because of the optimizations we did. The developers are much happier working in this environment, and actually the whole team, product, QA, engineers, everyone is a lot happier working in this pipeline than they were previously. So Abdur, would you recommend headless to someone else?
Yes. So here's the thing. When we are actually implementing headless and doing the research, one of the things that we found is that if you guys are using Sauce Lab, regular VMs, the amount of time it takes to launch a browser before running the test on the regular VM, we found that headless would actually open and actually complete the test before a regular VM would come and actually bring up. So that's how fast it is. So absolutely, if you're looking to run your test and get feedback early in the development phase, that definitely headless is something you should look into. Again, we are using headless for development in the development phase. We don't use headless to actually do our regression before we go to production. So we are using early in the stage to get that quick results feedback to the developer, get those bugs fixed before we actually go to QA and go from there. If you think you want to run a lot of tests in parallel, headless is something you should look into because it's low cost, so you can actually get more containers that you can actually run your more tests at the same time and get that runtime down to where you want to be.
So that's the presentation we put together. We deliberately kept it a little bit short because we anticipated some questions, which we're going to open that up to the floor now. But wanted to throw up, if you guys have questions, but that you don't think of during this time or just want to reach out with us and connect with us later, I've got my Twitter and LinkedIn up there, as well as was mentioned previously, I do some streaming on Twitch, so I've got the links for my Twitch and YouTube channels as well.
Yeah, I'm not as as well versed in the social media, so if you can find me in LinkedIn, if you can throw me any question if you have, and definitely connect.
Yeah, so questions, guys?
You said that you actually still run the test regression cycle in the nightly on other browsers. Have you found any issues with other browsers which you don't find with Headless?
We really haven't, and that was one of the big concerns that we had going in is, is a passing test in Headless going to reliably predict a passing test in Chrome on a normal VM or Firefox or Safari or Internet Explorer? And what we've found is that I'm not sure of the exact percentage, but it's roughly like 99% of the time, if the entire suite passes in Headless, then it's going to pass in the other browsers. Generally speaking, when we encounter a browser, for example, like on the Internet Explorer run or something like that, that is usually a quirk that we have to run a specific edge case around to the test on Internet Explorer more than a bug that was missed in Headless. Generally speaking, if the application is stable, most of the time it's going to be stable for the other browsers. That multi-browser run that we do really is just a sanity check at that stage, just to make sure that everything's good. Obviously, any failure that pops up in that, we still go back and investigate it before releasing. But what we've found is that we very rarely see something get through the Headless pipeline and into QA that ends up causing an issue on a specific browser.
I want to add one more thing. So we have about 85 to 90% tests running on Headless. The rest 10% that we cannot run on Headless, we're running them on regular VM in the CD pipeline. Mm-hmm. So everything is running. The one that cannot be run on Headless, we're also running them in the regular VM. So when it gets through QA, it's pretty clean slate. Yeah.
Oh, and because we didn't cover it in the initial talk, I do want to speak to the size of our framework. We have over 400 end-to-end tests between like over 200 on desktop and about 130 or 150 on that run on the mobile version of the site. So, the way that we're splitting it up, we run basically like 25 headless containers for desktop and mobile. And then for the VMs, we only run about 5 VMs now, where we used to run more than that. And the tests on the normal VMs are actually finishing faster than the headless tests usually in that run. So that's kind of how we've split it up.
Could you give us an example about a test that doesn't run on Headless? You have to run it in Chrome.
Right. So the one in particular that we had issues with, again, so our sites that we work on at RentPath are primarily apartmentguide.com and rent.com. Those are our two biggest sites. If anyone here has ever looked for an apartment, you may have used our sites to do exactly that. So we have a big part of our site is the map. So we've got a Google map integration that has a map with a bunch of pins representing properties. Now, because we had trouble getting that map to actually render in Headless, the tests that we had that click at the map to pull up a card that is associated with the pin, those tests wouldn't run in the Headless container because the map itself wasn't rendering. So those tests we still run on VMs. There was another one where the
tab click.
Yeah, so we have when you click on a listing, it opens up the property in another tab. We're actually encountering we're actually encountering an issue in Nightwatch that's a bit quirky right now, where it's opening 2 tabs rather than 1. And because of that, we mentioned the smaller memory capacity. So some of those are crashing the Headless container as well. So that one's less stable as well right now in Headless, but we think that we can fix that by going in greater detail. The thing is that rather than getting stuck on blocking the implementation and the speed gain, what splitting it up allowed us to do is that we can say, okay, we've got these handful of tests that aren't running in Headless, but we don't want to give up that coverage in our continuous deployment pipeline. So it makes it much less painful to quarantine that test temporarily on the Headless run if we can still run it and have it stable on a virtual machine, and then we can in our automation sprint pipeline, we can put that into our workflow and go about stabilizing it, because the ultimate goal is to have everything running in headless. It's just that by splitting up the pipeline in that way, we're able to maintain 100% coverage without having to have every single test that was running smoothly in a VM completely stable on headless. So we're able to work on sussing out those little details and things like that. And usually some of them have been tweaked, some of them have been taking a very large test and finding ways to make it more modular and split it up more. Does that answer your question?
So I had a question. Are there any diagnostic features that aren't available for headless testing, like, for instance, a video of the test, or is the headless even able to render a video?
Right, so headless does not have video. They do have screenshot. That's one of the things that our concern was earlier when I was talking about maintenance. So it does give you screenshot, but does not give you a video.
Mm-hmm. But the screenshots, the way that it works when you're using it in headless is that it steps through each line of the code and takes a screenshot at each point. So it plays out very similar to the way that the video playback works on a normal virtual machine. So that initial concern that we had about making the debugging much harder actually ended up not being a real issue for us, because with the way that their screenshots, the way that they take, you can actually see it step through the code, and you can see, oh, this test is failing to enter text into, it's failing at the point where it's trying to enter text into a modal that's open. Well, it's failing because the modal's not open yet. So we know that that just like how the video gives you a clue that that's where you need to start looking and trying to optimize your code and make sure that it's clicking at the right place. That's the same kind of thing that the screenshots do. So a lot of those debug features, everything that's there is pretty much there for headless out of the box as far as our needs are and
right.
what
and
we're using.
That's in the Sauce Lab side. If you're using Sauce Lab currently, that's what you get with the regular VMs. That's what you're going to get with headless as well, minus the video.
Right. Yeah, you're not going to be able to see the real-time video.
Okay, so my question is, why would you say that some of the industry leaders that we have are saying things like, hey, I've never booked a hotel room on a headless browser? Because that was something that came up on one of the talks that we had. Right. So my question would be, like, why would you say that there's that stigma with headless?
Right, I actually went up to the gentleman after the talk, because I was actually in that talk. I actually went up to him and I asked him about his comment. So his comment was that there's companies out there that actually using headless for everything. They're using it in the development cycle, they're using it for their regression, and they're using it, before going to production. So that's a complete no-no. We're not doing that. We don't recommend anybody doing that. You want to use headless in the beginning of your development life cycle, where if your developers are pushing code, they want to get quick result so they can move on and fix those issues that they're seeing and merge their PR and move on to the next thing. But we are using, so that's what he agreed upon. The gentleman that actually made that comment, he agreed upon that because I actually went up to him. But later in the phase, you should be using regular VMs to run your cross-browser testing, because you have to imitate what the end user is going to be, how end user is going to be using, right? So.
Right. Our recommendation for this is not to eliminate normal browser testing. It is to get to the point where you're able to fail faster earlier in your process so that you catch most of the bugs that would have been caught later at an earlier stage. Although the other thing that I would say in response to that is, while none of us as human beings have ever booked a hotel or submitted a lead for an apartment in a headless browser, the reality is that all a browser is doing is running your application code and rendering it in a visual state so that it's friendly for a human being to interact with it. The headless browser is still running and executing the code and interacting with it in much the same way that Selenium is going to interact with a headed browser, which is why in our test environment, the headless browsers are successful at catching pretty much all of the same bugs that the normal browsers catch. And why what we've seen in our results is that the vast majority of cases, if all of the headless tests pass, we can reasonably assume that all of our multi-browser tests are going to pass as well, which is really what you want. In a healthy pipeline, you want all the bugs to be caught in your CD pipeline, and then that final run of the multi-browser check is just a sanity check that you expect to pass. You don't want to catch bugs at that point. And what we're seeing in our implementation is that, generally speaking, if all the tests pass, you push clean code in, those multi-browser checks are going to be clean as well.
Thank you.
I have one other question about, so you said you guys have 400 test cases approximately that runs, so 90% of it runs on headless. Did you guys have to make any code change to make it run on headless, or was it just seamless?
Yes, we had to do some workaround. I was mentioning it earlier that headless, because headless runs faster than the regular VMs, whenever we were rendering a page, some of the tests were failing. They're flaky. Mm-hmm. So we had to add another check before the actual check that we are going for to give that leverage for that element to be visible to do that check. So that's the workaround that we did, and that actually worked out pretty good. We didn't need to do that, though.
No, yeah.
So the regular browser, we did not need to do that because it was waiting that extra. Regular browser was giving that extra 2 to 3 seconds. It was taking that 2 to 3 seconds or milliseconds for that element to be visible. Headless, we didn't have that. So we had to add that leverage to be able to do that.
Right, and I should clarify, we didn't have to make any code changes to the application code.
No, not application.
It was test code, and generally speaking, the optimizations that we had to make it stable and headless were actually exposing cracks in our automation code that we wanted to fix anyway. It made the test code better and more optimized as we were going through and updating it for headless. It basically was tech debt maintenance that we knew we had to do anyway, and it just bubbled it to the top of the priority stack.
So I'm kind of not, I just kind of had a question about, right now you're running the test headless as part of the PR process and non-headless as part of the release process. Is it the same test case running in both configurations?
Yes, so we didn't go too deep into our tech stack, but we are on a React.js application, so we're using Nightwatch.js for our automation code. The exact same test cases that we have defined run in headless, run in Firefox, Chrome, it's all the same test code. We don't have to have a special set of tests that only run in headless. And I don't know if there's anyone in the audience who's ever worked with Phantom.js or anything like that before. We had tried using Phantom.js as a headless option previously to try to do the same thing and run faster without using VMs. And that was where a lot of those initial concerns about stability came from, was that we really had trouble getting Phantom.js to run in a stable manner. The headless Chrome implementation that we're using in that we used in the Sauce Lab beta and has now, as I understand, gone live, much more stable than that. We don't have the same stability issues that we had trying to get Phantom.js working.
Another thing I want to mention is the implementation. When we actually start looking into Sauce headless, it didn't take us a long time to actually implement them. Within a few days, working with Sam and a few other folks, we were actually able to implement, get our test running. But again, we had some flaky tests. It took about a sprint, I believe, to actually get that in the pipeline. So it didn't take very long time to actually get that in the pipeline. Any more questions?
So do you have to buy the headless thread separately?
Yes, I'm not going to speak too much to the particulars on cost. Sam can talk more about that, but yes, the headless containers are a separate purchase option different from the virtual machines, but I'll let Sam talk exactly about the particulars on that.
Yeah. But from what we know, it's a lot cheaper. Go ahead, Sam.
Yes, it is a lot cheaper. Talk to your account manager to get yourself set up. I will not speak to pricing because I'm in product. But yeah, it is a separate, similar to if you have a VM offering set up as well as a real device plan, similar to how that works. So you just get set up separately. they were a unique case because they were using the Sauce Headless Beta, which was free. Unfortunately, that is over. So we're in GA now, which is great because it's super stable and it's ready for you guys to use and it looks really nice. But yeah, talk to your account manager. Also, I'll be demoing how it actually works in Sauce's version of it tomorrow in the demo theater, as well as a talk at 1 p.m. to sort of further this.
So what was you said you had a goal of like 5 minutes, or what was the goal for?
7 minutes.
7 minutes, and is that like just end-to-end UI testing, or is that including your unit and integration level as well?
That's just the UI testing. The unit, so similar to pipelines that have been described in previous presentations, the unit tests run much earlier in our build process, and then we have a review environment that gets built in a Docker container that creates a URL that we can hit that then the end-to-end tests run after that point. So the unit tests run first. Those are much quicker, obviously. Unit tests are always much quicker than end-to-end tests, but that's specifically the end-to-end test runtime after the build, after the review environment has been built. That runtime used to be 20 to 30 minutes. Now it's under 7, and we're working on getting it further optimized to try to hit that 5-minute mark.
Yep. Cool. Any more questions?
Last
Hey guys,
question. Yeah.
can you hear me?
Yep.